Okay, so this is a case entitled the Internal Revenue Service, the Automated Collection System. It's about the IRS, which is the United States Department for Collection of Taxes. Now, this actually talks about how this particular organization, which is the IRS, actually shifted from one system of handling various issues and queries, their collection system, from one monitoring system to a new one, and how that was actually taken by the employees that were working there. So this case happened somewhere around in 1989 when Tim Brown, who was the Assistant Commissioner for Collections of the US IRS, actually had this report with him, which said that the new system has not been liked by people. They're not happy with it. There's a lot of a lack of morale. There's a huge drop in motivation, and employees think that they're being monitored all the time. The productivity has increased after this new automated system has arrived, and the collections that they're now doing are much higher, but people aren't happy. So this is what this case is actually about. So let's look at what the IRS organization is. The primary function is to collect revenue for the US government, so therefore it's a very important function. Its mission is to collect the proper amount of tax revenues at the least cost to the public, so they're trying to be as less painful to the public as possible, and that's their job. So in 1988, for instance, the IRS had received and processed more than 194 million tax returns and collected around 935 billion US dollars, and dealt with 83 million taxpayers' requests for more information or any kind of assistance. So you can imagine the kind of load that this organization actually has, and that it needs to deal with. So it operated on a budget of about 5 billion US dollars, which is quite a bit in 1988, and had around 120,000 employees in over 700 offices across the United States and in some cases abroad as well. So the technology played a huge role in the IRS's operations, and Mr. Brown, who's actually, as I said earlier, is the Assistant Commissioner of the Collections Department, is actually very much into the tech aspect of things. He understands and realizes that technology is going to enable the entire function of IRS to be more efficient and more effective, and that it cannot be ignored at all. So even in the 1980s, the IRS was already quite dependent on and benefited from IT, and it was continuously improving itself. So IT assumed a very central role in the IRS, and that actually started from the 1960s, and from the 1950s the trainings for this had already started. So I'll skip that part. It's pretty self-explanatory, so I won't really go into the details of that. So what Mr. Brown was talking about in the beginning of the case is actually the changes from the collections department from its earlier system into the new automated collection system. For that, we need to first understand what the collections department or operations actually did. So the IRS organization actually consists of a central office in Washington DC, and it has about 63 regional district offices, and collection is one of those 6 divisions. It's one of those 6 divisions that are part of the entire IRS organization. So the collection is responsible for handling cases in which the IRS, which is the Internal Revenue Service, actually has the accounts receivable, and all of those requests actually originate in the 10 national service centers. So what are those service centers? Service centers are those places where taxpayers actually go to file their tax returns and to process the bills for unpaid taxes, or any kind of notices they will receive for unfiled returns are actually issued, and they receive them there. So essentially, those 10 service centers is where all the tax returns are originate, and then they're handled by the collections department of the IRS. So when these situations actually occur, the integrated data retrieval system, which is a central information system, maintains the records on all taxpayers, and that's where the notices are sent to the taxpayers if they have not sent the returns in the right amount of time, or if there are some discrepancies, if there are any issues, if they're not resolved. So they are then forwarded to the collections for further action. So if any requests, any kind of issues have been identified by the 10 national service centers, they send it to the integrated data retrieval system, which checks and then sends the information to the collections department, who then communicate with the taxpayer and inform them about the issues, inform them about their unpaid bills or about their unpaid tax returns. So until 1983-84, the collections operation was actually called the collection office function, and it was organized into 63 districts. The IRS then decided to change it, and then it got changed and became the automated collection system that we're going to talk about in a while. So it introduced new computer technology and the reduction actually caused the 63 offices to become 20 offices, and they were now referred to as call sites, and each one of them served multiple districts instead of each one serving each district. So it resulted in a reduction of employees as well from 5,000 to 2,500, and the cases that these call sites originated in the same way like they were from the integrated data retrieval system, but now they were handling more cases per office, because from 63 to 20 offices, so obviously they are handling more cases now. So the relationships and the way that they are set up is shown in the exhibits in the cases. I'll skip that, you can look through it. So the structure of the COF was thus. The COF, or the collection office function, was organized along 6 basic functions. The first one is the process review units, then there were the outgoing call units, the office field units, the incoming call units, a walk-in unit, and a research unit. Each one of them could be considered as sub-departments of the collection office function. When cases arrived from the service center, they went to the process review unit, where they would be categorized by individuals and business accounts. So whenever they get new requests coming in from the integrated data retrieval system of the tax system itself, they would go for the process review, where they would be divided into individual or business accounts, and those requests would be put up into trays of 500 of these paper documents. If there's no way to contact the taxpayer based on the information that's given by phone or by letter, by phone, then a letter was sent, or usually a judicial order was sent to either take over the property that they're not paying taxes for in dire circumstances. So this is how they used to do it. The letters and levies were generated. They generated the incoming calls, and taxpayers had to either appear in person, and when the taxpayer would appear to pay their bills to the collections department, they would go to the walk-in unit. Accounts for which some kind of telephone could be found, then the outgoing call unit would make the call. So to summarize, the process review unit would look at the requests coming in for the unpaid taxes. They would categorize them into business and individuals. They would contact them. If they could contact them directly, they would do so. If not, by phone, they would do so. If not, then they would send them a letter. And when the customers would arrive, if they walked in themselves, they would go into the walk-in unit. If they were communicated through the phone, then the outgoing call unit would handle it. The outgoing call units primarily made outgoing calls. When incoming call units were overloaded, they undertook some of their work. So, whenever the calls being received by the incoming people were too much, the outgoing unit, which would be mostly free most of the time because they just made the calls, they would then help them out. Anyways, the office collection representatives as personnel in this function were actually would work on their desks with trays of paper accounts. So the office collection people, the office collection personnel were known as office collection reps. They would be handling this. They would review each one and then make the phone call for each one. Upon completion of the call, they would then they would note down the history of what has happened during their discussion. When they made the call, they would note it down and they would keep a record of it, and all this correspondence would then be would all be handled by the collection office function. The office field unit, which was another one of the sub-departments, consisted of personnel known as revenue representatives, and they handled cases under a certain dollar amount that could not be closed in COF, that could not be handled there. So if it was huge or a big amount, the office field unit would handle it, and they did not require more experience personnel such as the revenue officers. So if the amount was too small, then they would then they would handle it themselves. Otherwise, these people would handle it, which are the revenue officers. The revenue officers, the other major group of the employees in the collection field organization, handled high dollar cases. So there are two groups of people. There are the revenue reps that would handle a smaller amounts. Then there were revenue officers who would handle bigger amounts. So if the tax was of a larger amount, the revenue officers would handle it, because that would require them to visit the taxpayer. Right, so otherwise that tax issue could not be closed for that particular person. So revenue reps, like the office collection representative, made outgoing calls from the office, and in some cases, if the taxes had not been paid, they would even make visits. The incoming call unit handled all the calls generated by letters and the levies, which is the court orders, or by individuals that were sent to their places. So they would handle the calls whenever a customer or a taxpayer, so to speak, would call, and they would ask for details. They would be given those details, they would be explained the case to them, they would be told how much they're supposed to pay. So it was difficult to close incoming call cases, because obviously there was a lot of anger from the taxpayers perspective. They would ask for a lot of details and stuff, so the representatives did not have the cases in front of them, and it was often very difficult to find them amongst the huge amounts of applications that they had. So they were just piled up. All the applications that they had received for the unpaid taxes were just piled up. So whenever a customer would call, it would be very hard for them to find that particular case file and explain to them the issues with it. The walk-in unit staff dealt with taxpayers who appeared physically into the office to pay their taxes or to make their installments if the IRS would agree, and obviously they had to deal with that. The research unit, whose personnel were known as the TARs, or the tax account reps or tax account representatives, handled even more difficult cases and special project cases, referred to as the problem resolution program cases. Such were cases that were ongoing disputes with the IRS based on the amount that was owed or would require some kind of immediate resolution. So these are even bigger than the ones that we discussed slightly earlier, which was under the revenue officers. So huge tax amounts usually related to business were handled by the TARs, or the tax account reps, in the research unit, because that was the detailed issues. Then the CUF was an operation that had lots of papers, so loads and loads of papers, and almost every decision that needed to be taken or needed to be thought about involved paper. So every time an employee worked on an account, they had to write a summary sheet and attach it to that entire case. And from time to time, and from the time that an account was actually received to the time it was fully processed, there would be about 10 to 15 sheets of paper. This was for every individual. For every individual, the sheets of paper would get added up, and it would be a huge thick slab of documents for just one particular individual who's trying to pay his taxes. So it was a hassle. It was a huge hassle to manage all that paper and to sift through it and search through it. So the paper problem was, of course, huge. Why? Because this would increase the inventory costs, and more specifically the cost of searching through all of this and managing these in a manner to handle all the call requests that they would get from different taxpayers who wanted some information about the taxes that they were supposed to pay. So in 1976 alone, they had about 614,000 accounts receivable in the inventory. By 1982, this had reached a number of about 2 million accounts. In dollar terms, the accounts grew from 1.7 billion in July of 76 to 7.6 billion in December 1982. Now just imagine these huge stacks, or I should say pillars of paper that they had there that they had to handle to. So according to this report about the CUF having problems that we talked about in the beginning, it was a cumbersome, outmoded and paper-laden system that they could just not handle anymore. So those who had worked in the collections office function said that it was a huge hassle. Taxpayers would write to us, and we could associate with the correspondence and with the account only 20%. So only 20% of the time, it says in the case, that they could understand which customer was talking about exactly which issue and where their file is supposed to be. So it would get lost in the huge piles of paper right there. Managers and employees both said that the CUF had come to a point where it was absolutely out of control and we could not handle it. And one employee related that her manager used to time with a stopwatch how long it would actually take to find a case. And sometimes it would take up to 3 hours to just find one file in that entire office. Another employee said that it took about 60% of the time to find something in the inventory. Of their entire day, it would take about 60% just looking for stuff. So they were just trying to handle all that paper. So the system was not efficient at following up in the cases either. So if there was a case that was ongoing where a person was trying to pay the taxes, it was just as hard. Account reps would tell, and especially the more complicated case, the account reps would tell taxpayers that they had 10 days to pay, and then nobody would call them up again and remind them, and then that was lost in the system again. So taxpayers knew that the time frame was really slow. So even if somebody was told that you're supposed to pay in 10 days, they knew that even if they paid after a couple of months, it won't matter, because the IRS won't be able to call them back again, because they won't even have that information available to them. So there were lots of other problems in the CUF as well. The employees in the incoming call units had a lot of difficulty in handling the calls because they did not have access to the taxpayers' accounts, their information. So if a person would call and ask about the amount that they were supposed to pay to the IRS, they wouldn't get an answer, because their file was not something that the incoming calls unit, the person handling the phone call, could find I mean, if other people can't find it, these people definitely didn't have access to it. Again, remember, it's all paper based. This is the late 80s, the early 90s. So it was horrible. So there was no background information available, there was no access to those files, it was very difficult. So overall the CUF was very unstructured. The offices was actually structured in a manner, it was a very large area with lots of desks, a lot of paper, so everybody would be running around trying to find things, screaming and shouting at each other. So the employees had a lot of freedom to move around, and they would ask each other, talk to each other, but still it was a hassle, it was very disorganized. Now let's talk about the control systems. So the control systems that were in place was that the CUF supervisors would track trays of accounts by a cycle. So each week was considered a cycle, and they would notice how many cases were being resolved within a week. So they would try to meet weekly with each other to see how much work has been done and if anybody needed any help. The supervisor's activities therefore usually was about planning what to do the next week, then following up with their plan and checking the progress of the plan itself. So individual performance appraisal was done once in a while, not all the time, because to review those work, the CUF supervisor would have to look at all the trays and look at how many accounts were handled and how were handled well and how many of them weren't handled properly, and there was no way to do that. For the most part, the review process consisted of just monitoring the cases, not the individual. So they weren't looking at whether person A in the IRS was handling cases well or person B was handling it better. They were just looking at how many cases were handled in total in a week. So that was a bad way, because this way a good employee could not be identified from a bad one. They all looked the same, because they were just trying to look at the number of cases resolved in a week. So there were a lot of freeloaders. There were a lot of people who were working in the IRS department, in the CUF department, who weren't doing anything, while 5 or 6 other employees were doing all the hard work. But obviously they would both get the credit, because they would just look at the number of cases supposedly resolved, and there was no monitoring of that either. So moreover, the trace of work was actually not really checked weekly. They was just checked once every 4 or 5 months, and that again is terrible. So they moved from the CUF system to this new system called the automated collection system. And when Mr. Brown had started, he had started to think about this transition. So a lot of the CUF staff, particularly those who were senior, were in the seniority, would transfer elsewhere in the system, and they did not go to the ACS. So they lost a lot of technical knowledge. That was also a loss. So a lot of people, when this new system happened, actually were sent to other departments, or were sent elsewhere, or were retired. So they lost a lot of technical expertise that these people had. So this is another weakness in this particular case that's been identified, even though this case is not about knowledge management system. But if you recall, we've talked about it in other cases, and when we talked about it in the very first few classes of the course, we talked about knowledge management system. So there was none in place to learn from these senior people, who had learned over time and through experience how to handle each of these cases. So these offices mostly had people who knew their jobs well, but when this new ACS system happened, they did not like it, and they got transferred to other departments, and they lost the technical expertise. So the new people had to be hired, and they were all mostly new, and they didn't know how to handle these cases for the new ACS system, and they had to learn all of it all over again, because there was no knowledge management system in place. So that was also a problem. Now, a lot of the reason why people did not come along to the new ACS system, as per the older system, oldies. The oldies said they don't want to be tied up with the computer system. They didn't want to work with computers, so they decided to get their departments changed. That's what Mr. Brown learned. That's what the case says. Anyway, so what is the automatic collection system? The automatic collection system was a computerized inventory system. It actually consisted of 3 computer components. One was the connection with the integrated data retrieval system, which is the system that would tell the CUF earlier and now ACS about the requests that of various tax payments that were due. That was connected to the main office of the IRS, IBM themselves, and the Rockwell ACD, or the automated caller distribution. The IDRS was the master computer, as I said. This was located in the 10 service centers where that was linked to all the ACS call sites, the 20 ACS call sites, where the requests would be generated from service centers that this and this person or these many people have not paid their taxes. Please call them up or handle them. That's when the ACS would handle them. This is what the IDRS did in the integrated data retrieval system, and this IDRS was in turn connected with what is the equivalent of the NADRA in the United States, known as the Social Security system. So that's how they would connect with them. Anyways, the taxpayer information was actually put into this computer at the service center and then fed, and this information was sent to the ACS call sites. If and after the fourth notice to the taxpayer had not been returned, the IDRS also then sent the ACS with the data and said that these people are not responding to our calls to pay, now you handle them. So then the ACS would handle them. The IBM system that we talked about had the main database of all the ACS accounts, because this is an earlier case. So there was a simple mainframe instead of a database being distributed into various branches. That would happen much later. So this is a very old case, which is why this was happening. So the ACD, the third thing, which is the automated call distributor, that was the way to route different telephone calls. So if multiple calls were coming in, so this was like an earlier system of the call systems, the call centers that we have today, where if 50 people are calling, the system would then send the call to the first available representative. So this was done to handle that. This was a phone system that they had. So the overall system had various capabilities. It could handle third-party contracts, automated information handling, lots of things. So it could handle a lot of volume of calls at the same time. So cases could be accessed in the ACS by putting in the tax ID number of a person, and then they would get that information. So this system was better compared to the paper one, where you had to look for a physical file. This system had all that data into a database. So there was a 3-tiered priority system in which it used to work. The first priority was given to time constraint cases where the tax needed to be received as quickly as possible because the deadline was approaching. The second was assigned employee cases where some cases were assigned to a particular employee. That was the second list. And the scheduled follow-up data cases where, let's say, a particular taxpayer had said that they would be paying within the next 10 days, then they would need to be followed up, or they needed more information after a few days, then they would need to be followed up. So time constraint cases were accessed when a best time to call the taxpayer had been identified. So let's say a taxpayer said to call them in the evening, then they would be called at that point in time. Assigned employee cases were seldom used since account reps actually regularly reassign their cases for the follow-ups. So this was not used that much. It should have been, because if one particular employee is handling 10 or 20 specific cases, they would know the details of those cases better than someone else being assigned to them, and because they'll have to read them all up again from the beginning, which is what happens whenever we, say for instance, make a call to a call center. Let's say a particular person XYZ picks up the call, we talk to them, let's say the call drops or the call ends. 2 days later we call up, another new person picks up the phone, and then we have to tell them the whole story. That causes problems. The similar problems are happening here. The scheduled follow-up cases actually related to the most of the cases where they were supposed to be called for the first time, and then they would be followed up, and then the new date would be given, and then they would be followed up again. So this was based on the dollar values, the amount, the large dollar values would be followed up immediately, but the ones with the smaller values of payments, outstanding payments, were followed up a little later, but they were followed up. So what was the structure of this ACS? The ACS was structured differently. It was structured on 3 basic functions, unlike the 5 or 6 functions of the CUF. This was actually based on 3 basic functions: the contact, the investigation, and research. Just three sub-departments. So after the respective service center sent out the notices, a case information was sent through the IDRS to the ACS. It was stored in the database, and then it was given to the ACS. Right, and then that was accessed. So the contact function, the contact representatives, because it only had 3 functions. The contact function would be a person sitting on a computer. They would type in the ID number, they would press enter, they would get the taxpayer's telephone number, then they would make a phone call. If the line was busy, the computer would then set up and suggest a time to call after a while, and they would remind the person to call them after that time period has passed. So the contact representative would then reach in the second slot and then the third slot whenever it's appropriate. So finally, once the call goes through, they would then talk about it and then decide on what actions to take. The investigation function, which was the second department, was similar to the function that used to be called the process review in the collection office function. So the investigation staff tried to find the phone numbers of taxpayers who were not available, or their phone numbers were not available. So they would look through phone directories, they would try to find third parties, they would try to look for the various properties owned by those people to contact them there. So it was their job to find missing data basically about the taxpayers so as to contact them. The research function, when the ACS sites were first created, the research function would handle the most difficult cases, right? Later on, in some of the call sites, the incoming calls were also handled by a contact nurse. So the research function would then access the IDRS and the ACS terminals, the systems, the computers for where they were getting the data from the main IRS mainframe, the main computer that had all the data. They would get information from that. So in changing to the ACS, things changed. The 6 functions that happened in the CUF, now there were only 3 systems, right? So the simplified structure meant that the ACS would be able to close a lot more cases of higher amounts as well. So they did not have to worry that much. So the research function now had lesser worry now, unlike the earlier times. So the ACS became more of a backroom operation. There was no direct communication with customers. So this new structure resulted in the operation being isolated from the rest of collection, and less integration was required. So the ACS no longer had personnel linked with their collection colleagues. So this research department no longer communicated with the customers directly. Okay. So ACS rooms had employees working on their computers. They were, unlike the earlier offices where everybody was talking to everybody and there was a lot of socialization, that wasn't happening in the ACS, in the automated collection system, the new system, because everybody was now doing their own jobs. So as cases appeared on the employee screen, they were randomly assigned to them. They would then only see piece of cases and they would solve those specific pieces. They would just assign their tasks, either to make a phone call or look for the data or call them up and then explain stuff to them. Basically, they were just given tasks. So each person was on their computers doing their tasks. So there was no reason to move from your station to another system, and that meant no socialization. So none of the employees were talking to each other. So this technology that they introduced, there was a lot of reintegration. These 3 specialized functions were actually integration of the 6 ones, but all of these employees were now working separately. So there was more isolation happening. So more isolated and less likely to follow individual cases through completion. So what happened was, it wasn't like one employee was handling the entire case through and through, from the phone call to the entire completion. Now they were just doing a part of it. Maybe either making the phone call or doing the research part or calling them back up. So they were just doing that. From a performance standpoint, the ACS solved a lot of the CUS problems. Because now everything was on a computer, there was no losing a file, there was no issues about calling them up, there was no issues about not getting responses, there was no issues about receiving a call and not having a file to answer a potential taxpayer's query. So the response time in ACS was much faster compared to earlier. Earlier it used to take them up to a couple of hours and sometimes even days to find a file. Now that didn't happen. That was all on a computer. So employees could quickly bring up the history or the record of every single taxpayer and explain things to them. So this was actually helping quite a bit. Now as for the control systems. Now another difference between the CUF and ACS was the performance monitoring. In CUF, this was being done by the supervisor. We talked about it. The supervisor was supposed to do it on a weekly basis. They were looking at number of cases, not each individual's performance. But in reality, they were just being able to do it once every 4 months. And there was a lot of lack of monitoring. There was no real appraisal of how many cases were being solved and how well were they being solved. Closing a case didn't really mean anything. I mean, closing a case would just mean, if say for instance somebody was in the call unit, they'll say, yeah, I resolved the case. I received their calls. I'm done with it. Real closing would happen once the tax was actually received, and that was not being monitored. So in terms of office performance, the computer actually provided managers a lot of information, because now the managers, the supervisors knew exactly what each individual employee was doing, whether they were doing their jobs, how many calls they received in a day, how many calls did they resolve, how many cases did they close, how many queries did they answer, how many pieces of data did they look for. So now the supervisors knew exactly everything. They were being monitored. And that will become a problem as it was being shown later on. So the ACS technology allowed for additional real-time information and performance indicators to be coming up. As I said, the number of accounts closed, the number of dollars collected, of money collected or in tax payments, the agreements for full payment, for installments, everything was now being recorded. So now the monitoring could be done on an individual basis. And we could appraise each employee individually instead of in a group of people. Now we knew who were bad performers in a team and or in an office out of the 10-20 offices that they had, and who were good performers in doing the jobs. Now the computer monitoring was the biggest issue. Okay, a lot of these supervisors had access to employee. They had access to their employees' average talk time with the customer. The calls were recorded, so they could actually see or listen to what was being talked about, how much time did they spend away from a computer, because they could see them moving away from a computer, and so they couldn't really walk around, chit chat and socialize with other people. The time that they wasted or did not use between their calls, the number of calls that they made to a customer and completed them properly. So all of that was being recorded. Now a lot of employees didn't like that. Okay, especially the telephone monitoring part. They did not like that because telephones were actually being recorded. Every phone call was being recorded. So every employee had to do at least 2 completed calls to taxpayers, or a minimum of 1 hour per employee per week had to make calls and had to be monitored. So supervisors were listening to conversations and they were rating the employees on the basis of how many times that they were talking correctly about correct procedures, the courtesy, the issues. So it's very similar to the call recordings being done these days for quality assurance whenever we call a bank or any such place. But this was something that the employees didn't like. They felt being watched all the time. They felt being monitored all the time, and that made them very nervous at times. So the employees were being notified whether if they were doing well, or notified if they're not doing well. So they were under a lot of stress. So there were also a lot of teach reviews of employees' work. What happened was every week there was a review where every employee was told by their supervisors of whether they were doing things correctly, whether they were making right decisions and recommendations, whether they were doing the right follow-ups and everything. In other words, the appraisals were actually happening every week. Okay, so this was one of the distinctive features of the ACS, that there was a lot of review process happening, unlike the COF. Now, from a management's perspective, this was brilliant, but from an employee's perspective, they weren't very happy. So supervisor and employees, how did they react to the change? That's what the case talks about next. The technology in ACS actually made the supervisor's job more rationalized. It made them more sensible. It made sense now what they had to do. Their work became much less fragmented. Now they knew what they had to do, what they had to monitor. But the problem was there were still issues. They said, the supervisor said that they felt like watchdogs. They felt like they were guards, like just police. They were just monitoring everyone, that we are just the bad guys. We're supposed to monitor everyone and just keep an eye on everybody, like they're little children. And that's what the employees said too. The employees said, we feel like we're being treated like babies, like we are supposed to be watched all the time, that we don't know our jobs, that we are going to be told how to do our work. So there was a feeling among the employees that they were being controlled, that there was the big brother's eye watching all the time. They didn't like that. None of the employees liked that. So the supervisors felt differently. They said that this control thing that we have, it helps us identify the weak employees from the strong ones, and this is a good thing. But the supervisor said that we are now able to control it better, but it kind of is still too much work. The supervisor said that we wanted to focus more on the reviews, but most of the time we were just focusing on monitoring the telephone calls. 60% of the time of a day we were just monitoring phone calls instead of actually reviewing the progress and helping the employees do their jobs better, which was a terrible waste of their time. So a significant amount of supervisors' time was wasted in doing one review or the other instead of actually helping the employees. So telephone monitoring took up roughly about 15 hours a week. That was the minimum. And on average it took about 20 hours. Counseling employees, then they were left with just 4 to 5 hours. And the teach reviews, where they were supposed to teach an employee about if the case was complicated, was only given 6 to 8 hours. So imagine, most of the time was actually being wasted on just monitoring the phone calls. So supervisors were not very, very happy about this. They were angry about this, and they resented that this time was being wasted in this way. And the employee feedback was also not that great. So employees felt that they were stuck in one place. They could not move around. They could not meet other people. They said that according to the supervisor, if I'm not on my terminal, even if I'm taking a bathroom break, that the supervisor would think that I'm not working. And they felt that we were just getting tired sitting in just one place because we wanted to move around. But they couldn't do it. Some people enjoyed, the isolation. Some people preferred sitting in one place and just being, happy about it. But most of them did not. So in the 25 years, one employee actually said, in the 25 years that we've been here, they never felt as if they're stuck in one place like they do because of the ACS. So in short, they weren't happy. They weren't liking the monitoring. It was good from a feedback point of view that their supervisor would know whether they're doing their jobs well, especially the employees who were working hard. But many people didn't like it. They said it felt like they were being spied upon. So the conclusion of the case actually suggests different solutions. It says different solutions. There are three different options that Mr. Brown could actually think about. The first option was to restructure the whole ACS, because obviously there were complaints, right? So they could structure it in a manner that they could create autonomous teams, instead of each department, each of the three departments handling cases differently, they would make a team structured around different areas. So say for instance, if they get tax payment cases, say of individuals who are salaried, white collar people, then there would be a whole team there are experts in handling that kind of issue. Then say tax payments from a blue collar person, let's say tax payments from an organization, maybe a manufacturing firm or several other firms. So instead of having one individual just do one chunk of a particular or one small portion of a larger case, which they felt very unconnected to, which they were unable to see to complete fulfillment, they should make teams. So each team would be responsible to handle a set of cases that would be assigned to them from the beginning to the end. So from contact, research and investigation, the entire team would work as one group, and they would solve those 10-20 cases that were assigned to them. That was one option. So to create semi-autonomous teams. So within this entire AACS system, they would, instead of having individual employees in contact and research investigation, they would have teams created of people from each of these sub-departments of the contact department, the research and investigation, and be assigned 10 or 20 cases. The second option was to retrain the ACS employees to become more versatile and handle all of the aspects of collection function. So each employee would handle everything from beginning to end. Instead of working in a team, they would individually be handling an entire case. This would also be a possibility, but there is a problem with it. The problem was, this would mean increasing the salaries, this would mean training those people, this would be very expensive. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of each of these methods. The last option would be within the organization would be to change the way that the system was managed, right? So this would be that the monitoring information system needs to be changed. The nature of the positive and negative feedback should be changed. The clarity of the criteria used to rate the performance should be clearly mentioned. The method of monitoring should be either be changed or done something about it, where right now the employee felt as if the supervisor was right there. So either we change it to the supervisor sitting in some other office and randomly making a check on the phone calls, or sitting in the same room as all the employees and keeping an eye on them like an actual guard, right? The changes in the supervisor's knowledge of the job. Should the supervisor also be trained? The supervisor's leadership style. And lastly, the employees' willingness to be monitored. Either they're happy about it or not. Some employees are actually happy about it, some weren't. So these factors had to be looked at. Now, this is what the case tells us, these three possible options that we could take. Now let's take a look at how each one of them could be done. Okay, how each one of them could be handled. So these suggestions could be handled, they could be looked at, but there were issues with each one of them, right? And what are those issues? Let's look at each one of those issues. The first one that talks about work teams, there's a huge advantage in that. The advantage would be this would increase the social relationships. This was one of the complaints, right? They said we felt isolated. In the earlier CUF system, people socialized. They felt like they were part of a team, that they were all working together towards the same goal. This team system would help bring that back. So it would be a sort of a middle ground between the old CUF system where everybody socialized with everyone, they felt like a family, and they would learn from each other's experiences, and yet in the new AC system where everyone should be able to be monitored as a separate entity and be appraised accordingly. So bringing them back into a team option would solve that problem. So that could be a plus point. But the negative point of this is that there would be a huge cost, because now the hardware would need to be created in such a manner for each team that it would be able to handle all three processes, the collection, the contact, the research, as well as the third step, right? So this would be requiring more hardware. So more inventory would need to be brought in, more computers would need to be brought in for each of the teams, right? Plus you'll have to train each member of the team to be able to do all three steps of the ACS, all three stages of it. So this would of course increase the salaries, right? They would ask for more money. And so this would take a long time, right? The option of making one single person handle the entirety of the case, of one case from beginning to end, from contact to all the way to actual collection, this too would mean more training. This would mean learning more technologies and each employee being trained thoroughly and being able to handle all of that, this would increase their salaries too, and that would be a huge cost incurred. The last option was to leave things just the way they are. That could also be a possibility, right? Especially on a supervision process, and that was least costly. But this would be the most problematic, because that's where the problems were actually coming in from, because people would still be working on bits and pieces of cases and people weren't happy about it. So in the first two cases, if we take any of the first two steps, understand that the supervision problem will still have to be addressed, right? People need to find a solution for that. We need to think of the solution for that. So regardless of what option we choose, whether we decide to create teams or if we decide to make all of the employees handle the entire process of the case individually, right? In either case, the supervision problem needs to be solved. So we need to come up with a better solution for it. Now there are various solutions for it. In my opinion, the best solution would be to, instead of doing a constant monitoring of the phone calls, it should be randomized, right? And the customers, the people who call to the tax office, the ACS, should be given a rating system like they do today, right? When we rate a particular customer rep's responses to us, when we are about to switch off the phone, they tell us to rate the conversation we had, whether it was helpful or not. So the rating system should work, and the rating system shouldn't be the only way. The person receiving the call should also be allowed to rate the customers, so as to cross-check it, so that if there is any customer rep in the ACS office, some employee, that is a problem, we could then check the records and find out whether the customer was needlessly complaining about him or if they were actually right. So this counterbalance system would be a good idea. So there needs to be a rating system. Plus, there should be weekly coaching and trainings for any employees who are having problems. The monitoring of the phone calls should not be done in real time. Their phone calls shouldn't always be monitored. They should be recorded, yes, and they should be told about it. But the supervisor should not be asked to keep on listening to the phone calls all the time. They can randomly check when they want to, or if and when there is an issue. Plus, I think there should also be another system where, and it is implemented these days, where the customers or the taxpayers, potential taxpayers, when they make a call, if they're not satisfied, they should be allowed to contact the managers, which is the supervisors in this case. And as soon as the supervisor handles that case, then they should call in the employee to ask exactly why that happened, why the customer was so dissatisfied that they had to contact the manager or the supervisor. So what we need to learn from this case is business process redesign, of how information technology actually provides a powerful tool to enhance an entire organization and redesign it and improve the processes. Plus, we should also be aware of the power that a management has over controlling work processes as well as employee performance. So they can control it to a very high degree, they can monitor it to a very high degree, and they have control over not just the output but also the behavior of the employees. And they need to be very careful on how they use that. So if they are very overly controlling, the employees are not going to be happy about it. So they need to focus on the outputs and whether the key performance indicators are showing the right results. And if required, they need to control the behavior of the employees by having a behavioral control, and then help use that to control the output. The organization of the work itself, that's another thing that we need to understand, that many of the employees were angry. They were like, we are sitting in front of the computers all day long, about 8 hours long, and that drops our morale. We feel demotivated. So that's also something that matters, right? So if they were to be put into teams, things would be better for them. They'll feel like their job is enriched. Instead of just having them put in data and make phone calls, or an individual just look for data, or another one just making follow-up calls, it is better to keep rotating them, enriching their jobs, and involving them with other tasks. That would happen in a team environment, right, where they'll be asked to do different tasks together in a team. That would destroy this monotony. You remember the division of labor theory that we studied way back in Principles of Management? That's what it's talking about. That is a terrible idea, because people don't like that. People are not machines. They're not going to enjoy doing one task for 8 hours straight. That's annoying, that's tiring. Also, another thing that an organization needs to understand is that technology is not the only thing. So technology was initiated, it was modified, but it needs to be left up to the worker as well as the organization to understand how much technology should be involved and how much the workers should be allowed to do their jobs, and that the technology should help them do their jobs, not be used to monitor the employees to that level, and that the same technology could be used in a positive manner to coach them, to supervise them and make them better, and the same technology could be used in a negative instrument. So the same technology could be used to help enhance the work efficiency, or it could be done to basically hammer the employees with a stick. The technology could act like a stick. So this is essentially what the case is all about. So there is a little bit of an update information about what happened. So the company, the IRS actually did, and the collection of function did actually move towards a team-based approach. The monitoring was still being done, but it was now the focus was more on the feedback rather than evaluation, so that the employees didn't feel like they were being watched all the time, and the supervisors didn't feel like they were just watching them all the time. They felt more like coaches. The turnover is still high because people still want to go to the older system, but at least the performance is better. So there are differences amongst offices. There are 10 different offices. In some offices they embraced the new change easily, in others they did not, and that's pretty much it. But let's look at some key differences as a summary of between both the systems, the old one and the new one. So in the earlier CUF system, the technology was mostly manual. There were typewriters, pencils, paper, and it was a step-by-step prescriptions written in the manuals for handling cases. In the new ACS system, it was all computer based. It was all data retrieval. It was faster. You could search through all of those files on a computer and you could find the right files. The work process in the CUF were diversified by having 6 steps, and there was a lot of job rotation, and there were diversification in the functions. In the new ACS, the jobs were reduced from 6 to 3. There were more response time, but there was less job rotation until they changed to the team based system, where there was more job rotation and job enrichment. The control of work process, if you look at it, the supervisor had a lot of control. They needed to control the in the CUF, they were controlling the accuracy of cases by reviewing how many employees completed how many cases. So there was a lot of substantial control that was handled by the employees. In the new ACS system, the control was mostly computer based, and there was a lot of tracking of each individual's progress, and it was now under the supervisor's control. They could monitor everything. The performance, the control of the work results was only occasionally done by the supervisor in the CUF every 4 months, but now in the new ACS it was done in real time. Behaviors were monitored, progress was monitored in real time, all the time. The phone calls were even recorded and monitored all the time. The supervisor's role in the CUF was about mostly about planning and organizing and controlling. In the new one, it was all in the new ACS. It was all about monitoring until they changed that to more of a feedback or based one. Interaction with peers in the CUF was very high. There was a lot of socialization. There was a lot of moving around. In the new one, there was little interaction until they switched to the team-based system later on. That's not mentioned in the case, but that's what they did, and that's what I recommended. So anyways, the office climate earlier was busy, non-restricted, everybody could move around. In the new one, it was cubicles, everybody was isolated, and supervisors didn't like people talking to each other. So in short, this case basically talks about how the system switched, and despite it switching, there can be problems. Even though from a technological standpoint, from a technical standpoint, the new system was obviously very great. It was amazing. It was solving all the problems, but from a people perspective, there was a lot of problem, because the technological aspects were handling the efficiency really well, yet the people actually involved weren't very happy about it. So the automated collection system, the new system, was not really looked at as a reengineering project. It was more about control. It was more about making it easier. Had they actually seen it as more of a business process reengineering, things would have been a little different, right? There would have been more stress on measurement and on objectives instead of just the controlling aspect. So it should have been called a proper reengineering project. They should have taken more input from people. It would have been better that way. So what should they do in the future? I've already discussed that. In my opinion, they should definitely go for the team-based approach. That would solve a lot of problems. They should have less monitoring, more feedback. They should focus on improving their employees, training them better, right? And moving them around in the jobs instead of actually keeping them in this one task. That would automatically happen as the teams happen. And they should keep on investing on our technologies and keep on making better. In fact, that's what happened. To give you another update that's not mentioned in the case, since this case happened, the IRS kept on reengineering. They kept on improving the technologies. In fact, in the next 15 years, since the 1990s, till 2005 they spent another 20 billion US dollars to redesign their system and processes, and the IRS is now an example of the world's largest reengineering project because they keep on making changes. The reengineering efforts have been very much contributed by what is happening in the collections area and department, because that's where the major changes happen, the major information changes happen. So that's pretty much it about this particular case, and I hope that it makes sense to you, because this is a very simple case. So that's about it. Thank you.